Hello, and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, July 31st. We're here today to talk about a movie that will be shown at the Arlington Common in a couple of weeks, on August 13th to be precise. Lost Nation is a movie that deals with the early years of Vermont, I guess you could say. And we have three folks here to sort of give us the overview and preview of it. We are really pleased to have here in the studio Bill Budd, who is the curator at the Russell Collection at the Martha Canfield Library in Arlington. Bill, welcome back to GNAT. Good to see you again.
Thanks for inviting.
Also very pleased to welcome Avis Hayden, who is a Sunderland resident and historian, and perhaps just as important, a member of the town cemetery commission.
Yeah, that's very important.
Critical job. Avis will be giving a talk before the movie begins on August 13th about Lucy Prince, who is one of the two main characters that is in the movie Lost Nation, which was written, produced, and directed by Jay Craven, who we have on the phone line. Mr. Craven, welcome to GNAT.
Yeah.
Good to have you with us. We appreciate you making the time for this conversation. Lost Nation is a movie that, well, I guess you could say sort of tells parallel stories of Ethan Allen and Lucy Prince, who are two Vermonters who each played significant roles in different ways during the 1770s and 1780s as the Revolutionary War was going forward. And Mr. Craven, I know you're well known as a director of and producer of many films, many of them Vermont-based, Vermont themes, through your company Kingdom County Production. And again, really appreciate you being here with us. I think it's fair to say that most people watching probably have heard of Ethan Allen and know kind of roughly who he was and all that. Lucy Prince, perhaps a little less well known. Her poem Bars Fight is commonly considered to be one of the first poems by an African American. She was a resident of Guilford, Vermont, which is where part of Lost Nation is set, but also lived right here in Sunderland. And so Avis will fill us in on her background there. But just to get us started, Jay, let's turn to you. I wonder if you could kind of describe the film Lost Nation and what is it about?
Yeah, the film is set during that period of mid-1770s. It follows parallel storylines for Lucy Terry Prince, as you say, sort of pioneering poet who was enslaved at a young age, 3, 4, 5 years old, served a family in Western Massachusetts, married a formerly enslaved man, Abijah Prince. They had a family, and Abijah was gifted a New Hampshire grant of probably 100 acres in Guilford, which was also a hotbed of pro-New York sentiment. So moving into an area where they not only faced individual challenges, but the turbulence of that moment where Yorkers and Yankees essentially were confronting each other, added to the drama, certainly of that time. And so I see the Princes and Ethan Allen having similar themes in their work, one of which are focused around themes of land and freedom. Ethan Allen on a very big scale, and the Princes on a much more intimate scale, where land was everything. It was status. It was a way of life. It was a consideration of wealth and position. And the Princes faced opposition to their settlement by, in fact, their closest neighbor, a guy named John Noyes, who was a man of means, had been a fairly unpopular lawyer in Connecticut, and had also moved to Guilford. On the Ethan Allen score, we have a grand story that starts by showing him visiting the Continental Congress to celebrate his victory at Fort Ticonderoga, and wanting to get pay for his men and to propose an invasion of Canada, of all things. Ethan's journey takes him back to Dorset, where he is rejected by his men in an election for commander of the Green Mountain Boys Regiment. Seth Warner is elected instead, a fellow Green Mountain Boy. And of course, Ethan embarks, regardless, to insert himself into the patriot cause in Canada, where outside Montreal he is engaged as a civilian observer, but immediately takes action to launch his own raid into Montreal, which fails miserably, and he is put on a prison ship, and we go from there, including his return to Vermont, where he leads an invasion of Guilford to the Packers Corner Tavern in Guilford, where he starts going through the tavern and house to house, arresting people who are resisting Vermont rule, really. And so anyway, it was a turbulent time in Guilford. It was a turbulent time on the west side of the Green Mountains, where Ethan Allen's allies were dominant. But as I say, on the eastern side of the Green Mountains, particularly the southeast, Yorkers were dominant. But there were nonetheless people holding New Hampshire grants in southeastern Vermont as well. But anyway, it's two parallel stories, both focused on the quest for land and freedom.
And what gave you the idea for the movie? And where does the title come from? What does Lost Nation refer to?
Well, I've been interested in the Ethan Allen story for a long time. I moved to Vermont on May 1st, 1974, moved into an old farmhouse where it was 34 degrees that night, and I couldn't figure out how to heat the damn place, and figured out the next day that it had a wood furnace in the basement. I'd never even imagined such a concept, but went and got a chainsaw and started cutting firewood. Couldn't haul it in my VW van, and was loaned a farm truck by my next door neighbor, and hauling a big load of wood down a steep hill. The brakes went out. I bailed out, broke my arm, got 10 stitches in my back, and spent the next 3 months holed up at the research room of the Vermont doing research on the Green Mountain Boys. And so that planted the seed for me that this would make an interesting movie. Now, but in any case, I turned to making other movies, Vermont movies, as you say. I made 5 movies based on stories by Howard Frank Mosher. And I always had the Ethan Allen movie in the back of my head. Since that time in 1974, there's been new research about Ethan Allen, particularly the work of John Duffy and Nick Muller, that interested me. And then also I discovered the book Mr. and Mrs. Prince by Gretchen Gerzina. I taught at Marlborough College for 20 years, and Gretchen was an alumna of Marlborough College. And so I began to think both stories were fascinating, and I wondered if there might be a way to combine them, and that's what I've done. And, frankly, I think it's sort of working better than I expected that it would. But in any case, each of the stories is quite dramatic, infuses energy into its own path, and I think, frankly, into each other's stories as well. So anyway, I think that the idea of making a movie that is about our own culture, our own history, and being able to engage a public in a consideration of that history and of that culture, and to begin, because both Ethan and Lucy, to a certain extent, have a mythic status. But let's try to explore them more down to earth, and that was my goal.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, Avis, let me turn to you. Tell us a little bit about Lucy Prince and her life, both in Guilford and Sunderland, although we're more familiar with her life here. How did she arrive in Sunderland after living in Guilford?
Well, we don't really know. We don't know her motive for leaving Guilford, although, as Jay has hinted, she was harassed and ridiculed during her time there, and so that may have been part of the motivation. And also in 1794, her husband Abijah died, and maybe after he was gone, there was some impetus or something in her mind that said, why don't we try a different place? Now, Abijah had secured the rights to, and that's an important phrase, he did not own, he did not buy, but he had secured the rights to 5 parcels of land in Sunderland. And so in her mind anyway, she probably thought she could come and live on any one of those parcels of land. To answer your question, we have no idea how she got here. I think a horse was probably part of that mode of transportation, maybe a covered wagon, maybe an uncovered wagon, we don't really know. What I would give my eye teeth to know or to have witnessed would have been Lucy's arrival in Sunderland. If you can picture the scene, 4 or 5 dark-skinned people arriving here in this very white Protestant New England town with about 300 or 400 people living here, and to just see how that conversation had played out. But anyway, she wanted to be able to live on Lot 20, which was central to what today we call the Sunderland Borough, only to find out that a man named Eli Brownson actually owned that parcel of land. So there were many years, 8, 9 years of disputes in the courts until the court finally awarded that parcel of land to Lucy Prince. And I'll go into more detail on that and more depth on that when I give my talk in a couple of weeks, but suffice it to say, or the outcome of that story is that Lucy and her family wound up living on a portion of that land until the last one of the Prince family members died in 1854.
Okay, so she's famous for writing this poem, Bars Fight, which I think basically refers to a skirmish between some settlers and some Native Americans down in Massachusetts, where she was living at the time,
right.
I think. And Bars Fight was the name of the place, as opposed to not a fight in a bar, but it was a location.
So a bar, or bars, is the term for a meadow or a swampland, and it's kind of an open area as opposed to a woodland area. So that skirmish took place in the bars. So that's where she got the title for her poem. And keep in mind, so the poem commemorates the people who died in that skirmish, all of whom were white, Deerfield settlers. Keep in mind 2 things about this poem that I think are significant. One is that she was 21 when she wrote this poem, so it had only been 16 years since she herself was involved in some kind of skirmish in Africa where she was kidnapped or taken by slave traders, pulled away from her family and brought to this side of the ocean. And that she was able to witness a skirmish like that and write about it, to me, is amazing, how that would have been emotionally for her. The second thing to know about the poem is that it was not written down. It was told to other people through oral, through conversation and story. And it wasn't written down until 1855. When somebody in Springfield, Massachusetts picked it up and wrote it for the newspaper there. So she had that thing in her head, and she could recite it.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing
better
story.
than what I could have done. And Bill, let me bring you in here. Ethan Allen, I think anybody who spent more than 15 minutes in Vermont probably has hears about Ethan Allen, but he also was a resident of sorts of Sunderland and Arlington, I guess. Before the revolution started, he and the Green Mountain Boys were also pretty active in a lot of back and forth with the neighbors across the borderline in New York.
Yeah, the big conflict was with the land claims from New York, who said New Hampshire grants are invalid and we can give land to whoever we want, after the New Hampshire grant folks had purchased their property. But Ethan Allen lived in, as far as I can tell, 4 main places in Vermont. when he moved up here. One was Bennington, another was Arlington and Sunderland. There was the third one, and then Burlington area. But he made his mark wherever he went. He was very outstanding in that sense.
And of course, this is all timely in another way too, because next year we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the march from, I guess, from Bennington up to Fort Ticonderoga, would pass right through this area.
Right.
And Ethan Allen was the leader of that march that successfully assaulted Fort Ticonderoga and sent a whole bunch of cannons down to the siege of Boston.
Yeah, it's a statewide program that's being developed right now, and in Bennington County, we're going to mark the march through Bennington County from Connecticut and Massachusetts up to capture Fort Ticonderoga in May next year, 2025.
So we'll be hearing
right
an
through
awful lot
town.
more about Ethan Allen
Yeah.
as well. I was wondering, Jay, back to you for a second. Did Ethan Allen and Lucy Prince ever meet or cross paths in some way, or were they just two people who were living separate lives in the Green Mountains?
Well, that's impossible to tell. And given the scarcity of any information at all about Lucy that can be known for sure, it's hard to know. Let's put it this way. We have them crossing paths very briefly during one of Ethan's two invasions of Guilford, which started at the Packers Corner Tavern in Guilford, which was about a quarter mile from the Prince homestead. So, like I tell people, 3 weeks ago in East Peacham, Vermont, I watched, 12 people standing around leaves burning for at least an hour. And if you happen to live a quarter mile from where 250 Green Mountain Boys had come in, were firing guns and precipitating basically a riot, I think it's frankly probably pretty likely that you would have meandered over there one way or the other, but maybe not. So we know that they came within a quarter mile of each other. In terms of Ira Allen, Lucy's quest for justice led her ultimately to a meeting of the governor's Supreme Council in Norwich, Vermont, which was quite a trek for her, to speak about the injustice that she had experienced at the hands of John Noyes and that her family had experienced. And the governor's Supreme Council included Ira Allen. So we have no doubt that Lucy crossed paths with Ira Allen. And in our film, we do have her briefly crossing paths during that night of Ethan's invasion of Guilford. I think that whenever you take on historical material and fashion it into a narrative, you inevitably invent and you inevitably create historical fiction, because who of us knows anything about the day-to-day experiences, the dialogue, the relationships that exist between historical figures, especially someone about where there is we do not have Lucy's diary. We do not have the diary of anybody in her family. We don't have a memoir from them. And even in the case of Ethan, we don't know precisely in any given moment how he would have acted. Obviously, we have a huge number of historical references to Ethan, and, we certainly work with that. We consulted 162 sources in the research for our movie, and we just donated all of those books to the library at St. Johnsbury Academy because it was a huge undertaking to try to examine what we could find. But in any case, we have no evidence that Lucy in fact crossed paths with Ethan, but we do have them exchanging one interlude where they speak probably a total of 10 words each in a public event, a riot essentially, in Guilford. The Prince's cellar hole is still evident in Guilford, and it's quite moving and impressive with these huge rocks that obviously Abijah had somehow fashioned into a foundation for their cabin. And only 75 yards away is the cellar hole of John Noyes with its beautifully chiseled, flat stone, a formidable foundation, and a house that's probably 4 times bigger than the prince's house. So we know where they lived exactly. We know where its proximity is to Packer's Corner Tavern. One thing I would add, I think, Avis's presentation is fabulous, and I'm very interested and anxious to meet her when I'm coming to Sutherland. In terms of why Lucy left Guilford, despite their valiant struggle to secure their property and to affirm their civil rights, they were worn down by the harassment they faced and had to sell that homestead in Guilford with the provision that they could remain living there until Abijah died in 1794, as Ava said. I think that the motivation for Lucy at that point, yes, she probably could have found someplace else to stay in Guilford, but I think knowing that Abijah had this potential asset in Sunderland motivated her to, once she no longer had the homestead, to set out for Sunderland, because that's the moment at which she lost the ability to live there, even though they lost the ownership of it sometime earlier than that.
Interesting.
Good. Well, yeah, and as you say to your point, Avis, it must have been a very strange life for them here. I'm sure they were probably the only African American family in Sunderland at that point.
They might have been, but maybe not. There were 250 African Americans living in that territory of southern Vermont during this time. And in fact, there was another African American family living just a mile or two from them in Guilford. We don't have time in our film to really explore that. And of course, people had servants. I mean, the Allens themselves had 5 black servants. We know the names of 2 of them, Eliza, who was the head house domestic servant, and Newport, who was a companion of Ethan's, who drove him places and served him in various ways. One other thing I would point out very briefly is Gretchen Gerzina, in her studies, revealed that Lucy bought paper in Deerfield, where she lived, which led Gretchen to believe that she did in fact write down poems, although none of them have survived. There also was a report that she would gather people essentially on like the porch of where she lived in Deerfield, who would come together and tell stories, recite poems. And so, as Ava said, this oral tradition of storytelling was quite predominant, and Lucy seemed to be not only a practitioner of it, but maybe even a sort of producer in her neighborhood of others coming forward to tell their stories.
So I wanted to add, Jay, that in my research, looking for other blacks in the area, in the census records, at least for Arlington and Sunderland, there were no other blacks living here. There could have been I think there were in Bennington and possibly in Manchester. I just don't recall that off the top of my head. But they would not have had a lot of people with a similar kind of background and story to them in arriving here. So
Yep. Well, I certainly accept that. I mean, I ran across one figure said 250 blacks were living in Vermont at that moment, which of course is not a huge number, and many of them were servants. And so yes, and we know so little. When you really dig into New England history, it's very hard to find anything specific about people of color. It's also, very frankly, hard to find much detail about women.
yes, very true.
I mean, we certainly found that. I mean, of course, there's a well-known book about an oral history, of a midwife from Maine during this era. But it's hard to find. I wanted to find out more about Seth Warner's wife, for example. Or Ethan Allen's wife. There just isn't anything out there. Although it's interesting, I think that Eli Brownson, who bought that
Yes.
property that you were describing, Avis, it was the cousin of Mary Allen, Ethan's wife.
Yes.
That's the point I was just going to make, that
Yeah.
of all ironies, they were cousins. So,
And speaking of historical record stuff, we don't even have an actual picture of Ethan Allen, do we? That is, or that
Nope.
we really know what he actually looked like.
The closest resemblance is General Hitchcock Allen, I believe his name was, who everybody said he looks exactly like Ethan. But there's no existing image. So,
Hitchcock Allen. Is that another cousin or something? Or
descendant, I think.
Oh, okay.
Later they called him Alfred Hitchcock, and he made movies.
Very long life in the family.
Well, we're going to have to run in a couple of minutes, but Jay, I just wanted to ask you this real quick before we have to run here. Was there anything unique or different about making this movie compared to some of the earlier ones you did? You've made several that were based in Vermont. Was this one kind of different in some ways from the others, or same basic kind of challenges you would have faced?
Well, it's basically an action picture at some level. I mean, I looked at it when we were finished editing. I said, geez, there's just nonstop action, turbulence, conflict. I mean, of course, conflict drives movies, and so that's part of it. I've always focused a lot on the use of music in my films, and I've had the same composers for 35 years. But I worked with those composers this time to find another composer, an African-American composer named Maz Swift. And so music is very prominent in this film and is brought forward so that it plays a substantial thematic, rhythmic, role in terms of the imagination of this story. And so I'm pleased with the way the music came together. And I think that music is more present and more substantially impactful of the narrative in this film than other films I've made.
Interesting. Well, we'll definitely look forward to seeing it. I know it's been screened in several locations already around Vermont. I think the premiere was on July 10th over in Brattleboro, and I know it'll be shown in several places around the state, but it'll be coming here to Arlington at the Arlington Common on Tuesday, August 13th at 7:30. Avis, you're going to be leading your discussion, at 7 o'clock?
no, I'll be at 6 o'clock, going to maybe 6:45. And then also, I'm putting up a walking storyboard in one of the small rooms in the Common. So if people get to the movie early and they want to mill around and read through some of that, that features Lucy Terry Prince's life in Sunderland. That's exclusively to her life in Sunderland.
Okay. So those of you watching, get there at 6 o'clock, because that'll be an interesting part of the whole evening. And it will also include a question and answer with Jay Craven. Jay, will that be after the movie is shown? You'll be doing your Q&A, or before?
Yeah, so I'll give a little intro to the film and then be there for the Q&A afterwards.
And Bill and I will also be part of the Q&A after.
Ah, okay. All right. Well, the gang's all here then. In other
Yes.
words. All right. Perfect. Okay. Well, you can register for tickets at arlingtoncommon.org, and otherwise, you pencil in August 13th at the Common, and it'll be back to history class, I guess,
Yeah.
as well as seeing a lot of fun and a great movie. Well, Jay, thank you again very much for making the time for this conversation.
Okay, people should get their tickets early. The shows have been selling out.
All right. Okay, that's good to know. All right. Well, thanks to all of you again for being with us, and thanks to you folks as well for being with us. Hope you found the show interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care. Thank you.